The prairie stretched wide and empty under a gray sky that hadn't known laughter in months. The wind rolled across the fields, slow and mournful, brushing against the windows of a small ranch house standing lonely against the horizon. Inside, the air hung heavy with silence, broken only by the weak, uneven cries of a newborn. The rancher sat at the edge of the bed that once held two people. His hands, rough from years of rope and rain, trembled as he tried to cradle the tiny bundle swaddled in faded linen. The baby's skin was pale, his cries desperate, as though the sound itself was fighting to stay alive. The man whispered something under his breath, perhaps a prayer, though he had forgotten how to finish one. The cradle in the corner still smelled faintly of the woman who built it. His wife's shawl was draped across the chair by the fire, untouched, her sewing left unfinished on the table. Every object in that house seemed to wait for her to return. But the ground outside had already taken her. She had left this world, giving life to another, and he was left to wander the days, hollowed out and unsure how to begin again. He tried everything to feed the child. Cow's milk, boiled and cooled, spooned carefully, but the baby gagged, turned blue in the lips, and wailed with a sound that stripped the man's soul bare. He had held cattle through storms, buried friends on the trail, seen death stare him down with cold eyes. But nothing made a man feel smaller than the sound of his hungry child dying in his arms. The sun set and rose without meaning. He moved like a ghost from one task to another, mending a fence, feeding the horses, splitting wood. He did it not for survival, but to keep his mind from remembering the warmth of her voice, the way she used to hum while kneading dough, how she always leaned against the doorway watching him work. Now the doorway watched him back empty. Old Caleb rode in one morning, dust clinging to his hat brim. He brought flour, a few jars of milk, and eyes that knew too well what grief did to a man. He said softly that there were women down near the river, families with new babies. Maybe one could nurse the child until he found his footing. The rancher thanked him, but didn't look up. Pride wrapped around his sorrow like barbed wire. He would not beg. Not yet. Caleb sighed and left with a hand on his shoulder, the kind of touch older men gave when words failed. When the sound of hooves faded, the rancher stood a long time at the door, staring at the tracks until the wind erased them. The baby cried again. He walked to the cradle, lifted the tiny thing to his chest, and tried to hush him with a whisper. His voice cracked. "Your ma would know what to do." He said it once, then again, until the words broke apart like dry wood under pressure. That night, lightning flickered beyond the plains. He sat by the fire with the baby against his heart, both of them trembling, both unsure how to continue breathing without her. The room smelled of ash, sour milk, and loneliness. The cradle creaked softly when the wind slipped through the window cracks, like the whisper of a lullaby gone missing. He tried to picture her face again, but memory played cruel tricks. The image blurred, the shape of her mouth, the light in her eyes, until all that was left was her voice, faint and fading. He felt anger then, sharp and clean. Anger at God, at the sky, at his own helplessness. He whispered to the walls that he had done everything right, worked hard, stayed faithful. Why did the good die? And why was he left behind? The storm thickened, rattling the roof. The baby whimpered, too weak now for a cry. The rancher pressed him close, rocking back and forth, whispering a broken rhythm to fill the emptiness. When the candle burned low, he reached the edge of surrender. He set the baby down, covered him gently, and walked to the door. The night air was cold and clean, washing against his face like mercy. He looked toward the sky, gray and endless, and whispered that if she was up there, maybe she could help him know what to do. He stood there a long while just breathing, until he thought he heard her voice again, a memory, or maybe something else, carried on the wind. He turned to go back inside when the sound came. Faint at first, almost lost beneath the rain. Then again, 3 knocks. Firm, hesitant, human. For a moment he thought it was his mind playing tricks, grief twisting sound into something alive. But it came again, clearer this time. He opened the door slowly, expecting wind, emptiness, maybe a lost animal. Instead, a figure stood there in the rain, a woman, soaked through, trembling from a cold. Her hair clung to her face, her dress dark with water, but her eyes were steady, even through exhaustion. She looked like she had come from a long distance, maybe from life itself, maybe from its edge. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. The air between them was filled with rain and the faint, frail sound of a baby crying behind him. Her gaze drifted past him toward the cradle, and something softened in her face, an ache, a knowing. He wanted to ask who she was, what she wanted, why she had come here to this forgotten patch of earth, but the words refused to form. All he could manage was a hoarse whisper. "You lost." Her answer came quiet, almost swallowed by the wind. "I lost everything." They stood like that, two silhouettes against a storm, each carrying something too heavy to name. The baby's cry grew sharper, hungrier. The woman stepped forward just enough for the light to touch her face, and he saw the exhaustion there, the strength beneath it. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded them, as though holding something she couldn't let go. He didn't move aside yet, still uncertain whether this was mercy or madness. But when the child's cry broke through again, weak and desperate, something inside him surrendered. The rancher stepped back. The woman crossed the threshold. The wind followed her in, curling around their boots before the door closed with a hollow sound. The candle flickered, throwing gold light over the woman's face and the child's tiny, searching movements. The rancher stood still, heart pounding, unsure if he'd just opened his home to a stranger or his salvation. Outside, the rain began to ease. Inside, a different kind of storm was only beginning to quiet. The woman stood in the middle of the room, her wet dress clinging to her body, her eyes searching every corner, as if to make sure this place was real. The rancher set another log in the fire, the flames leaping higher, shadows breathing across the walls like something alive. He said nothing for a long time, only watched the steam rise from her soaked sleeves, the small shiver that moved through her shoulders. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but sure. She said her home was south of here, past the cottonwoods near the river. There had been a fire 2 weeks ago. Wind took it faster than they could run. Her husband, her baby, the life she had built, all gone. She had walked for days, not sure where to go, only knowing she couldn't stay among ashes. There was no drama in her telling, just the stillness of someone who had already wept herself empty. He listened, half bent toward the fire, hands spread before the heat. Her words drifted through him like smoke through an open field. Loss recognized loss. It was as if her grief called to his, wordless and raw. The baby cried again from a cradle. She turned toward the sound, her whole face changing, the quiet despair in her eyes giving way to something instinctive and tender. Without waiting for permission, she stepped forward, knelt beside the cradle, and lifted the child with practiced care. The baby's wail softened against her shoulder, as if he knew what she carried within her. The rancher stiffened. His hand hovered near his belt buckle, a habit when unsure. "You don't have to," he began, but she shook her head. "It's all right," she said softly. "He's just hungry." There was a still moment when the words settled between them, heavy and human. She hesitated, her face flushing, but she didn't look away. He understood before she needed to explain. Her body had not yet forgotten the child she lost. She still carried milk, a strange mercy that now begged to be given. The rancher's throat tightened. He turned toward the window, as though the world outside could offer some guidance. Pride whispered to say no, that it wasn't proper, that this wasn't how things were done. But the baby whimpered again, thin and weak, and he found himself nodding without words. She sat near the fire, unbuttoning her damp dress just enough to cradle the child beneath the blanket. The flame light played across her face, calm, full of quiet reverence. The baby latched, and the room filled with a sound so small and holy it made the rancher's eyes sting. He turned away, swallowed hard, and listened to the soft rhythm of life being mended. Minutes passed. The baby's breathing steadied. The crying faded into the crackle of wood. When she looked up, there was color in her cheeks again, a faint return of strength. "He'll be all right now," she whispered. The rancher met her gaze. "You saved him," he said, voice low, almost ashamed. "I saved myself," she answered. The simplicity of it left him silent. There was truth there he couldn't argue with. She asked for a place to rest, somewhere warm, only for the night. He led her to the small room beside the kitchen, the one that once held his wife's sewing in baskets. He brushed the dust from the quilt, lit another lamp, then stepped back as she entered. She thanked him with a quiet nod. He stood in the doorway a moment longer than he meant to, watching as she laid the sleeping child in the cradle beside her bed, her hands moving with a mother's certainty. The scene twisted something deep inside him, a mix of gratitude and pain he couldn't name. When he finally returned to the fire, the night outside had gone still. He poured himself a small cup of whiskey, but didn't drink it. The silence was no longer empty. It carried breath, the faint sound of another person moving in the house. It felt strange, almost forbidden, but not wrong. By morning, sunlight poured through the cracks in the shutters. She was already awake, sweeping the floor with a branch broom she'd found outside. Her hair was tied back, her sleeves rolled. She moved through the room like someone who belonged nowhere but refused to be useless. The rancher watched her for a moment, unsure how to speak. "You don't have to work," he said finally. "I can't sit still," she replied. "It makes the hurt louder." He understood that too well, so he let her be. Days turned quietly into a rhythm neither planned. She cooked what little they had, fed the baby, mended clothes. He fixed the fences, fetched water, hunted rabbits for stew. They spoke little, but words weren't needed. There was something easier about silence now. It wasn't loneliness anymore, it was company. Old Caleb stopped by again, bringing feed and salt. His eyes widened when he saw the woman on the porch rocking the baby. Later, while the rancher tied his horse, Caleb spoke low. "Folks will talk, you know. A widow and a man alone under one roof." The rancher's face stayed calm, but his voice carried a weight that ended the conversation. "Let them." Caleb nodded slowly, as if remembering his own battles with gossip, then rode off without another word. That night, the wind shifted. The woman stood by the window, holding the baby, humming a tune the rancher hadn't heard since his wife passed. It wasn't the same song, but it carried the same warmth, the sound of a home finding breath again. He stood in the doorway, watching the firelight trace gold through her hair, and for the first time in months, the ache in his chest eased. When she looked up and caught his gaze, she smiled, not as a woman might smile at a man, but as one soul might to another who has survived the same storm. It was enough. He nodded once, quietly, and turned back to the fire. Behind him, her song carried on, soft and sure, weaving through the quiet house like a promise that grief was not the end. Weeks passed quietly, marked not by dates, but by small moments. The sound of the baby's laughter, the smell of coffee at dawn, the sight of her hanging fresh linens in the wind. The house no longer felt hollow. It breathed again, as if walls and wood had remembered their purpose. The rancher moved through his days with a steadier rhythm, no longer chased by silence. The woman had found her place in the rhythm of things. She cooked simple meals, mended torn sleeves, and sang to the child as she worked. Her presence was soft but strong, like the steady current of a river that shaped stone without ever raising its voice. She spoke little of her past, and he never asked. He sensed she carried memories she wasn't ready to set down, and he respected that, the way one respects a grave. Their conversations were brief but meaningful. She might ask about the cattle or weather, and he would answer in few words, his voice low and even. But sometimes their eyes met in a silence more honest than speech. In that wordless exchange, they both knew what it was to lose and still choose to live. One afternoon, he returned from a field to find her sitting on the porch steps with the baby asleep in her lap. She looked out toward the open plains, her face calm, but her eyes far away. He stood there a moment before joining her, setting his gloves beside him. "I used to think I'd never see land this wide again," she said, not turning toward him. Back home, the world felt small. A house, a fence, a grave. Then the fire came and made it smaller still. He didn't answer right away. His gaze followed hers toward the horizon, the same place he'd buried his wife not far from the oak tree. "It can take everything from you," he said, "and still find room to keep you standing." She looked at him then, a small, tired smile tugging at her mouth. "You talk like a man who learned that the hard way." "I did." The moment hung there, two lives intersecting in the quiet dusk, nothing romantic yet, only the weight of understanding. The next morning brought work. The rancher fixed the gate near the corral while she gathered herbs behind the house. She begun tending to small patches of earth, coaxing green things to grow again. It pleased him more than he cared to admit, the sight of color returning where death had once lingered. Later, as he brought in firewood, he found her kneeling by the hearth, the baby playing with a wooden spoon at her feet. She looked up, cheeks flushed from the heat. "He's strong now," she said softly. "When I first came, I thought he wouldn't make it." "He wouldn't have," he replied. Their eyes held again, the air between them charged with quiet gratitude that bordered on something deeper. He turned away first, setting the logs down carefully, as if afraid a wrong movement might break the fragile peace between them. Rumors began to drift in from town. Caleb mentioned it once, eyes wary. People were talking about the arrangement, about propriety, about sin. The rancher brushed it off with a shrug, but the woman's face fell when she heard. That night, after the baby was asleep, she told him she could leave if it would make things easier. He didn't let her finish. "You leave," he said gently, "and the boy loses his mother twice." The words caught her off guard. Her eyes filled, not with sadness, but with a tenderness she had not felt in a long while. "You really think of me that way?" He looked at her then, really looked. "I don't think on it. I know it." It was the closest thing to affection he had allowed himself since his wife's death. And it was enough. As the days warmed, they began to work together more, riding out to check the cattle, mending fences, gathering hay. She learned to handle a horse again, though fear clung to her at first. The memory of the fire and flight had burned deep into her bones. He stayed close, patient, steady, his hand resting lightly on the reins when hers shook. "Trust him," he murmured once as the horse shifted beneath her. "Animals feel what you fear. You give him calm, he'll give it back." She nodded, breathing slowly until the horse settled. The sun stretched long across the fields, bathing them both in gold. When she finally managed to ride a short distance alone, she looked back and found him watching with quiet pride. For the first time, she smiled without sadness. That night, she cooked rabbit stew, the air thick with warmth and spice. The baby babbled in the corner, and the rancher sat at the table, arms crossed loosely, watching her move about the room. She hummed under her breath, the tune rising and falling like wind through grass. It reminded him of a time before grief had hollowed him out. When dinner was done, he thanked her in his usual quiet way, but she caught something new in his eyes, a gentleness that hadn't been there before. "You don't have to thank me," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "I owe this house as much as it owes me." He nodded, the faintest hint of a smile touching his lips. "Then we're even." Outside, crickets began their song, soft and steady. The woman stood by the window with the baby in her arms, rocking him as the light faded. The rancher leaned against the doorframe, watching her silhouette framed against the last orange glow of the sun. For a long while, neither spoke. There was no need. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was peace. When she finally turned, she said softly, "He smiles like you now." He glanced at the child, then back at her, unsure how to answer. The words caught somewhere deep in his chest, too heavy to release. He only nodded. In that quiet, something shifted. Not love declared, but love realized, slow and certain as the dawn that followed every night before it. The kind that did not rush to be spoken because it had already taken root in the things they did, in the way they stayed. The baby sighed and drifted to sleep. The woman laid him down gently, her fingers brushing the blanket smooth. The rancher reached for the lamp, turning down the wick until the room softened into shadow. As the last bit of light faded, she whispered into the dark, "Maybe it's all right to start over." His answer came low, steady, almost a prayer. "Maybe it's the only thing we're meant to do." And outside, the wind moved across the plains again, no longer mourning, but carrying the quiet promise of something new. The sun was setting in molten bands of red and gold when Ethan rode out toward the ridge where he'd last seen the girl. Dust trailed behind his horse, curling in the still air. The world felt heavier now, quieter too, as if the land itself was waiting to see what he'd decide. Every mile he rode, the voices of doubt grew louder in his mind. He'd risked his ranch, his life, his name, all for someone he barely knew. But deep down, he knew it wasn't about her alone. It was about redemption, the kind a man didn't ask for, but earned with scars. He reached the valley where the Apache camp once stood. Smoke rose faintly from the remnants of old fires. He dismounted, scanning the shadows until movement caught his eye. The girl stood by a fallen tree, her dark hair catching the dying light, her posture neither welcoming nor afraid. For a long moment, they just looked at each other, two worlds bound by choices neither fully understood. "You shouldn't have come," she said quietly, her voice brittle as dry leaves. "Maybe not," Ethan replied, taking off his hat, "but I couldn't stay away knowing you were out here alone." "I'm not alone," she said, her eyes flicking toward the trees. He knew what she meant. Her people were near, always near. Ethan took a slow breath. "Then tell them I came with peace." "They won't listen. Not after what's been done. Not after blood's been spilled." He nodded, the weight of those words sinking deep. He had killed before, out of fear, out of duty, but now it all fell hollow. "Maybe they don't have to listen," he said softly. "Maybe you just have to." The girl turned away, her shoulders trembling. "Why? Why do you care?" Ethan's gaze dropped to the dirt between them. "Because once, someone cared for me when I didn't deserve it. And it changed everything." Her silence stretched long, broken only by the wind whispering through dry grass. Then, footsteps echoed, more than one. Shadows emerged from the tree line. Apache warriors, painted faces, drawn bows. Ethan stood still, every muscle tight, his hand resting near his revolver, but not on it. He wouldn't fight. Not this time. The girl moved quickly between them. "No," she cried, her voice raw. "He's not here to hurt us." The warriors halted, their expressions unreadable. One older man stepped forward, his hair streaked with gray. His eyes, cold and sharp, studied Ethan for a long moment. Then he spoke in a low, steady tone that even Ethan could feel was a judgment. The girl translated, her voice shaking. "He says a man's heart can lie, but his eyes do not. If you mean peace, leave your gun." Ethan hesitated, then slowly unbuckled his holster and laid it on the ground. The older warrior nodded slightly, though his gaze didn't soften. The girl looked between them, torn by something deeper than fear, the pull between loyalty and something new, something dangerous. "They'll let you go," she said finally, "but you can't come back." Ethan's chest tightened. He wanted to speak, to tell her that leaving wasn't an option anymore. But she was already stepping back toward her people, her face half hidden by dusk. Then something changed, a sound, a sudden shout. Another rider appeared from the west, one of the ranch hands Ethan had trusted. He came fast, rifle raised, panic in his eyes. "Ethan, behind you." The crack of a gunshot tore through the stillness. Chaos erupted. The Apache warriors scattered for cover, arrows flying. Ethan spun, shouting for the rider to stop, but it was too late. The old warrior fell to his knees, clutching his chest. The girl screamed, running to the fallen man, her hands pressed against the wound, her face a storm of anguish and fury. She looked up at Ethan, and for the first time, her eyes burned with hate. Ethan dropped his rifle and raised his hands. No, it wasn't supposed to. But the air was thick with vengeance. Warriors closed in from all sides. Arrows pointed toward his chest. For a moment, Ethan thought this was it, the end he probably deserved. Then the girl spoke sharply, her voice slicing through the chaos. The warriors hesitated, uncertain. Tears streaked her face, but her words carried the weight of command. Slowly, they lowered their bows. Ethan didn't move. His heart pounded, waiting for judgment. "Go," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "Before I change my mind." He wanted to protest, to stay, to explain, but one look at her told him it would mean nothing now. He backed away slowly, picked up his horse's reins, and mounted. The air felt heavier than before, the sky dark and vast above him. As he turned to leave, She called out one last time. You can't fix what's broken by staying here. He looked back, his face lined with sorrow. Maybe not, he said quietly. But maybe I can stop breaking more. He rode off into the gathering night, the land swallowing him whole. Behind him, the valley faded into shadow, its silence carrying the echoes of choices that couldn't be undone. When dawn came, Ethan was miles away, sitting by a dying campfire. The horizon glowed pale and cold. He took the girl's pendant from his pocket, a small carved stone she'd left behind, and turned it in his hand. It was rough, unfinished, but real. Like him. He tucked it into his coat, stood, and faced the open land. Somewhere out there, maybe redemption wasn't a word written in prayers or blood. Maybe it was something you built, one hard, lonely step at a time. And as the first light broke across the plains, Ethan took that step, toward whatever waited beyond the edge of his guilt, toward a horizon that, for the first time in years, didn't look like punishment but promise.